Is the second video in my series about Form Builder, which is my Swift iOS library for building forms, for displaying static data as well as data input fields, getting data from the user. Now, if you haven't seen the first video I did about Form Builder, then now's the time to go back and watch that. So definitely, so you'll understand what this is and what it does, watch the first video first. But in the first video, I didn't go into a lot of detail about what Form Builder does and how you can use it. In the first video, I just gave you a brief introduction to some of the features. I showed you how to import the Form Builder library into your Xcode project and get it running, and this is the result. This is just a simple application that has two input fields and a header, as you can see, and this is just basically I just chopped off most of the example specification file so that only a few fields were left. So it's basically the same thing, just without some of the other input fields. So today I'm going to show you where we left off, how you can actually display an object, pull in data from an object to display on the form, and save the object back to the form, and also how you can react to user input to dynamically change the form. I know that's quite a mouthful, but basically so the form can react to the user input. Say for instance they are entering an address, right? The user can change the country from a United States address to a Canadian address. So for Canadian addresses, they're going to be different fields. They're going to be, maybe a province field instead of a state field, for instance. Postal code instead of a zip code, things like that. So if you're entering in addresses, you probably want to be able to change the inputs based on what makes sense and what doesn't, as far as your current state of data input. So let's dive right in. Now, the first thing we're going to want to do is we'll pull in an object called address, which already exists. This is the file that or the class that I'm using to provide an example for the original Form Builder example project. So we're going to go to Form Builder Pod, Form Builder Example, and in here, inside Form Builder is our address class. Okay, so we'll go ahead and pull that into our project. Take a look at it. It's very simple, just has some strings and a boolean or two. Okay, now things like countries and states, they're going to be strings, but the string is the code, it's not the display string. I'll show you what that means. Okay, if you look in the settings file for a option set, okay, this is like a customized state option set that overrides the default. So you have an option set, the name is state, and you have for each one a code and a display string. So this is what you're going to get into your object, but this is what your user is going to choose. Okay, so it's more user friendly, but you're going to get a code. which is also going to be a string. And same thing for my customized country. I just wanted a few countries, so I made this customized country option set. Maybe getting a little bit off topic here, but just kind of showing you what the option sets are. Now, so we have our address. What we're going to want to do is when we start our test view controller, okay, first of all, we're going to set an address variable. So address is address, and that's going to be equal to, we'll just make a new address object, okay? So immediately we're going to get an address object. Now, before we load in our spec file, what we can do is we can set some properties for our object. We can say address dot city equals my city. Address dot street equals my street. Okay, so that's just going to give us some data that we can display in our form. And in order to set our fields, okay, let's take a look at our contact specification file first. Okay, now all of this is just, I've got a new mouse, by the way, so you'll notice my mouse isn't screwing up anymore. All of this is just explaining to you how the spec files work. You don't need that in your file. It's just comments. Here is all of the reserved words for the spec files, and then the rest is just kind of explaining everything. And now down here you get down to the actual meat of the matter: style, form, section, address. Style is section, title is address section, and you know, basically it's just a keyword, a value block, and optionally a comment on each line. That's it for each line. Everything past the keyword and that first space is going to be pulled in as data, or I should say that. Doesn't matter about spaces. You don't need quotation marks or any other kind of demarcation. Just everything after the keyword and before the comment is the value block, which tells you the data for your keyword. Okay, so now when you get down in here, the section's name is address because that's the ID. Okay, the lines, the first line is address heading. Second line is street, okay, and then, or street, yeah, that's the second line is street, and then within the street line is a field called street, okay. So we have address, street, street. And the reason why I show you this is because in order to get to this field, to reference this field and set the data in this field, what you're going to have to do is you're going to come in here to test view controller, and you'll say self.form.field with path, okay? And guess what the path's going to be? The path is going to be address dot street dot street, okay? And then you'll just take the data and set it to address.street. Okay, so what we're doing here is we're taking the field called street, which is in the line called street, which is in the section called address, and we're setting its data to our object here that we are displaying in this form, address, and specifically the street property, which is the string. And we set the street string right up here. Okay, maybe I'm just kind of pounding on this too much. I'm just kind of being too obvious, but I want to make sure you understand. My address for my object for this form is address. I set my street here, and so when I populate the form, I'm going to put that street into my form field like this. And also, by the way, okay, you see here I'm specifying the ID of the line, I'm specifying the section, I'm specifying the address of the line, and I'm specifying the address of the street. Okay? But there's a little shortcut here. This line called street has only one field. And when a line has only one field, you don't need to specify that because we already know which one it is. So all we have to do is say address.street. Now, if there were multiple inputs on that same line, you would need to specify which input you're talking about. But since there's only one input, we just leave that out. So we'll say self-form.field with path address.street data equals address.street. Okay? And you would do the same thing with city. So you could come down here and just copy and paste that and say address.city is equal to address.city. And now you have the data being loaded into your form, and so when you start it up, you can see that the data is being loaded up, and there it is. Street is my street, city is my city, because remember this one is in reverse horizontal orientation, meaning the label goes over here and the data goes over here. This one is in vertical, meaning that the data goes on the bottom and the label goes on the top. And so if you hit that, and now I can change this however I want, right? But when I save it, it's not really being saved back to the object. So it's still my street and my city. So now how do I save my data once I've entered it? Well, that's what this save override is for. So when I save, now this only happens when validation is successful. If validation fails, it never comes down to the save function. So we validated our object, our form, and all the required fields are there. They're all in the right format, etc. So they're ready to be saved back into the object. So how do you do that? Well, it's pretty easy. You basically just do the reverse of what you did before, and you're going to say address.street equals self.form field with path address.street. Again, there's only one field on that line, so you don't have to specify it. You just specify the section and the line. And then you say data Okay, now data is not really typed yet. It's a generic data type, so you'll have to say as string. And so this is going to convert this data into a string, and it's going to go into field. I think you can do an R there to handle that if it's null. Okay, it doesn't like that. So let's just say this is as question mark. Might like that better. Okay. And we can do the same thing for city. We'll just say city is equal to address.city as string. Okay, so let's try this. Now, when I save it, it should save my new data into my object, so the next time I load it up, it will still be there. Okay, so I'm going to say my street 2 and my city 2. I'm going to save that. Okay, and I'm going to come back in, cancel it, come back in, and you see it's still there. Okay, so every time it loads this form, it's going to get the correct value now because it is saved back into my object. Now, there's one other thing that we'll want to do. Now, the reason why we have these spec files with this very simple syntax is because we don't want our spec files to be difficult to create. We want it to be easy, straightforward. It's supposed to be very difficult to get this wrong and confuse everything up. Now, that's not, you can't say that about JSON. Everybody likes JSON, and JSON is awesome, but if you're going to make a file like this with a lot of nesting and different data types, JSON is kind of a pain in the butt because you get one comma wrong, or miss one piece of syntax, and your JSON isn't valid. And so you're going to have to dig through this whole long thing and figure out where you went wrong. Now, that's not the case with this boneheadedly simple format. It's just keyword, data block, optional comment, enter, and that's it. That's the same way for every line. These are the only keywords that you can use up here. So now I want to add a combo box to my file. Let's see how easy it is to do that. Okay, so I'm going to add a combo box to handle the country. And when they change the country, I'm going to change my form in order to handle different fields for each country. Now I'm going to open this up in, well, let's see. I'm going to open it up in Sublime Text because it's a good editor for these spec files. Unfortunately, Xcode doesn't do a very good job with them because they don't do the tabs correctly, and then it won't be able to correctly interpret your files. I know it's weird, but it puts spaces instead of tabs, and it's it's meant to be able to handle that okay, but I'd rather use tabs myself. I just don't like the idea of doing everything in spaces. So I'm going to use Sublime Text. I'm going to edit my contact.spec, and I'm going to add myself a combo box down here. It's going to be a part of this section, so it's going to be another line, right? Another line of data. The ID is going to be country. Okay, and then field is going to be the field inside this line. So in field, I'm going to do ID country once again. I'm going to make this type combo box. Okay, so this is a combo box. I'm going to give it a caption. Let's say the caption is country. I'm going to give it what option set it's going to use. The option sets are in settings. They're already there for you, so you don't have to define them, although you can define them right here in the spec file. You can define an option set in line, but if you don't want to do that, you can set it up in the settings file, and you can reuse it over and over again, and you just just call out to it here. Okay, so option set is going to be country. The value is going to be US, so it's going to start out with US selected, and I'm going to say required is true. Okay, so now that's all I have. That's all I should have to do. After this point, I should have a combo box inside my form if everything worked correctly. Let's take a look and see. And here we go. We have a combo box and it says United States. If we decide to edit this, we can change this to whatever country we want. Okay, right now, let's say I change it to Canada. Well, I can change it to Canada, but that's not really the same. Okay, let's say in Canada, we don't have street. Okay, so, but in every other country we do. So I kind of want this street to just kind of disappear and go away when I choose Canada, and then come back when I choose Burkina Faso. Okay, does that make sense? So how do I dynamically change my form based on user input? I'm going to come back here to test view controller, and I'm going to override a new function called field value changed. Okay. Now, what it's going to give me when somebody does anything with this form is the name of the field that just changed and the value for that, or not just the name, but the actual field and the value for that field. Is technically not really necessary, but it makes things easier. Okay, so what do I do here? Okay, let's say if the field is address.country, then I will, based on the user input or the value, change the form. So I'm going to do a switch field dot ID, right? And case CA, I'll do one thing. And then break and default, do something else. Okay? With me so far? So if my field ID, whoops, that's not right. My field ID is going to have to be country. And I'm going to make this lowercase. Okay, so the field ID is country. Now, if they're changing the country, then we're going to want to see, well, what country did they choose, right? So we'll come in here and say switch value as string. And if the case is CA, we will do one thing. If the case is anything else, we'll do something else. Okay? So, now if if they choose Canada, we want to hide the street. If they didn't choose Canada, we want to bring the street back. Okay. So it's pretty simple to do this. Once again, we'll say self.form dot field with path. We'll say address dot street dot visible equals false. Okay, and then down in here we'll say self.form field with path address.street is once again equal to true. Okay, now when you set a field equal a visible field equal to invisible, by the way, just a little side note, it will no longer be required. This field is required, but validation is going to skip over it if it's invisible, because obviously it's invisible, the user can't interact with it, so it's obviously not required in that context. Okay, but as soon as it's visible and it's required, then you're going to actually have data in there, or validation is going to fail and you'll get an error when you try to save it. Okay, so just to recap, okay, in field value changed, we'll check to see what field changed, and if that field is country, we'll check to see, well, what did it change to? Did it change to Canada? If so, we're going to hide our street. Did it change to anything else? If so, we're going to display street. And by the way, anytime you change your form, you're going to want to do a self.update display. But now, be careful about update display. Don't call this if you're updating text, because it's going to rebuild your form. And that's not going to work if you're entering text. And every time you type in a character of text, you're rebuilding your form. That's not going to work. Okay, so update display. And I think this is going to be optimized in the future so that it does less work based on what fields have actually changed. Instead of loading the whole table, we'll only load what needs to be loaded. But right now, it's kind of in a beta state. So there's a lot of features that are in my brain that are destined to come out soon, or sooner or later. Um, there's a lot of things that are going to change. Um, the 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 operation of cancel and save is going to change a little bit to make it more bulletproof. There's going to be a lot more visual styles coming down the pike pretty soon, so you can more fine tune what your elements and your fields look like, things like that, and also optimizing the table redraw, hopefully. But right now, update display actually reloads the whole table, so be sparing in your use of that. Only do it when you're changing combo boxes or option boxes or check boxes, things like that. Don't do it when you are changing text views or text input areas or text fields. Okay, so that's the disclaimer. So let's see what happens. It just doesn't seem like this should work right now. So let's see. Okay, so we've got our countries. We start off with United States. Let's edit it. Now, let's set it to Canada. Oh, come on, there's too many B's. Okay, Canada. Now, there's no street. There's only city. Okay, but what if I go to Burkina Faso? Okay, there's still a street. Okay. So this is how your data input forms can be dynamically changed based on the user input. So if there's a field that doesn't really belong with a certain type of data, you can take it out. You can add extra fields based on what the user chooses. You can disable fields. You can interact with this form in any way you choose. You can set required fields to be not required. You can set non-required fields to be required. You could update headings to accurately, represent what you're choosing. So for instance, I could change this caption in this header to be Canadian address or US address if I wanted to. Okay, so that's just a little quick tutorial on how to actually use the form builder once you've got it in your project. You can add an object to your form to display, right? If you have data already in that object, then when you load specification, once load specification is done, it's going to call populate, and you can take your object and stick the data from object in your form. Okay, you can interact dynamically, or you can update the form dynamically based on what the user is doing, and then when it's all over, you can take the data from the form and stick it back into your object. And that's it. Thanks for listening, and have a good day.